Welcome. More technical difficulties. Nothing is new there. Greetings. Okay, looks like audio is working. So today is something a little different. I haven't done a live stream in a while, so just catching up. And if you follow me on Twitter, you have probably seen that I am a bit of a security geek. And by that, I mean cybersecurity, as it is now called. It's kind of an unfortunate name, I think, but it seems to have caught on. And one of the big challenges that I'm observing, my personal interpretation, is that cybersecurity for small and medium businesses, specifically, I'll just share some context around dynamics, partners, and ISVs that I work with, is that it's challenging. If you have a small and medium business, whether you own one, work for one, interact with one, cybersecurity, it's just a challenge. It is beyond the scope of most organizations that I've interacted with, and I'll provide context for that. So that's what I'd like to talk about. And if you are into this sort of thing, if you are kind of vaguely interested, or if you're a geek like me, I would highly recommend this presentation by Jonathan Davis and Wael Abu Saida from Microsoft. They are very smart individuals who have focused on security as part of their roles at Microsoft and helping to secure the Dynamics product offerings within Microsoft. So they created this presentation, and I attended it at the Directions EMEA 2022 conference in Germany. And so you just go to aka.ms/security101 for SMBs. Now, it is a fantastic presentation, but it is 90 slides. So I think it was an hour and a half, 2 hour long presentation for them to go through quickly. And so it is not not quite as basic as what I think we might need in the SMB space. But if you're at that level, fantastic content. If you can follow even half of the recommendations, you are doing very, very well. So one of the things they shared is this presentation can help you move from the bottom 5% to the top 5%. Totally agree. If you're able to implement the recommendations they have, you will quickly be in the top 5% of organizations in terms of cybersecurity posture and preparedness. However, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that most people who take a look at this will be unable, it'll just be way too much. Your eyes are going to glaze over and you may not understand some of the concepts, terminology, or you only vaguely understand it, and then implementing it will be a fair amount of work. So great presentation. I highly recommend it, but it goes into some rather extensive discussion of different topics that can be kind of overwhelming for some if you are not used to having a security posture. So with that, I thought I would try even simpler approach, like just 10% of what that presentation offers. So let's see how this goes. So here's the context and assumptions that I'm using to kind of try and develop this discussion. Small and medium-sized business, what does that mean? Definitely less than 100 employees and potentially smaller than that. So think of your Microsoft, at least in the US, this is my context. A US Dynamics partner might have 3 employees, 5 employees, 10 employees. There are larger ones, but many of the partners and ISVs in the United States are not large organizations. So less than 20 employees, I think, might capture a majority of organizations. Limited or no dedicated internal IT staff. Very common for small organizations in the United States. No internal security expertise. I'd say that's 90+%, 95+% of small organizations. Like, really, at what point do you have an internal resource who has security expertise? I don't know that I met anyone short of the internal IT person who might have a side hobby or interest or just dealing with security as part of their job. No explicit focus on security. So you're so busy trying to serve customers, get work done, do accounting, paperwork, email, day-to-day stuff that there is no time left for a focus on security. Kind of like in a project, you implement the project and documentation kind of gets thrown in at the very end based on the few hours left in the budget, and someone slaps that out. It's like their punishment is they have to do the documentation, right? So it's kind of the last thing you want to be doing. Well, security is often that. Very small or zero dedicated security budget. So if you don't have a security staff, if you don't have a security focus, if you don't have security expertise, you're probably not going to allocate dedicated funds for security. You might, pay for an antivirus or something like that, but you're not paying for a security operations monitoring center. You're not paying for a SIM. You're not paying for endpoint, extensive XDR endpoint protection, YARA rules, right? Sigma rules, things like that. Like, these words probably don't mean anything to you. And in my experience, you probably don't have a managed security solution provider, an MSSP or maybe an MSP, depending on how you call it. Or if you do, it may be limited support from that MSSP because, common theme you'll see throughout this discussion, it's expensive. Just as you as a partner or an ISV may charge hundreds of dollars per hour or for your solution, well, these managed security providers charge hundreds of dollars an hour for their services. So I don't see that changing anytime soon. So it's expensive. So for further context, let's give an example of what we're up against here. A little exercise. One of your customers, let's say you're a Dynamics partner, you're serving, dozens or 100 different Microsoft Dynamics customers, whether that's Business Central, Dynamics, GP, Office, Azure, CRM, you name it. Customer contacts you and notifies you they received a phishing email from one of your employees' email accounts. Now, being a Microsoft partner or an ISV, let's just say you use Office 365. So it's fairly easy to glance at the headers of that email and tell that it is a legitimate email, sent from your actual employee's Office 365 account. So what does that tell you if it is a malicious or phishing email? Well, not good. What do? Open-ended question. If this happens, what do you do? What is your policy? What is your procedure? How are you going to respond to this incident? And if you have an answer, I'd say you're already in the top 10%, just by even having an answer that you can have at hand. Now, if you have a think about it, you're like everyone else in the 90%. That's pretty normal. Well, you learn that the employee's Azure Active Directory login was compromised by phishing. Very, very common. Office 365, fake logins, or, click on a link and authenticate to view this, to sign this document, whatever the case is for a phishing email. Once that AAD was compromised, you say, well, wait a minute, we use multi-factor authentication in our organization. Maybe you do, in which case that puts you in the top 75% of Azure corporate customers. But whether you do or not, in this case, Azure MFA was enabled. And you're like, wait, Steve, that's not possible. How can that possibly be the case? We have MFA. No one can steal our employee logins or, hack their accounts. Aha. And you realize that the AAD account for that employee had excess permissions. Part of their role in your small organization was they created users. They assigned licenses. So they had admin access to your AAD portal, your Microsoft 365 portal, Office 365 admin, whatever the case. Those portals, your employee had elevated access. Okay. You then learned that all of your Office 365 applications were effectively compromised through the theft or phishing of those employees' credentials. That would be your Office 365 mail, your SharePoint, your corporate OneDrive, etc. So if you are one of the many organizations that stores customer passwords in SharePoint or in files in OneDrive or has sensitive information in those, you can now consider all of that data breached. And I've heard arguments that, oh, well, if they got access to this login, that doesn't mean they'll get access to this login. Well, technically, you would hope that is true, but the more you understand about how clever these attacks are, the less you can rely upon that assumption. And so after you realize all of your Office 365 apps are compromised, you realize your Dynamics apps and services are compromised. So Microsoft CRM if you're using it, and Business Central if you're using it, etc., etc. It's the same Azure Active Directory login, right? And if someone's able to phish the employee credentials, bypass MFA, keys to the kingdom. Okay, so that's just made up, Steve. Come on, that's not going to happen. Well, this is as of July 2022. Microsoft detected over 10,000 organizations were targeted by a phishing attack that bypasses multi-factor authentication. Even if you've done everything right, even if you have MFA enabled, even if you have number matching, this phishing attack can bypass it. So how does this thing work? Well, it's a phishing attack. So an email comes in and it looks legitimate. The employee clicks on it. It comes to it redirects the user to what appears to be a legitimate Office authentication page. And this is an entire turnkey platform. The attackers just install this on some web server, apply a domain, they're up and running. And these things are so good, you would have a very difficult time distinguishing this from a real authentication website. So this Evil Engine X2 phishing kit allows them to have a portal that mimics an Office authentication. It can even do a pass-through authentication to the real Microsoft websites. And once the employee authenticates, they'll then be prompted for MFA code. They'll type in that MFA, and through this man-in-the-middle attack, they will pass that MFA credential information on to Microsoft to complete the authentication. They can then steal the authentication tokens to proceed and mimic that employee's login. So they've just compromised the account. It's not a vulnerability in MFA. You have MFA enabled. They just were a man in the middle. They were able to intercept that authentication code, pass it along, and on their way they go. So what is a recommendation? Even if you've done everything right, well, you need to do more. Organizations should up their MFA game with conditional access policies, which vet sign-in requests based on identity, IP location, and device status. Now, if you know what conditional access policies are, hats off to you. You're in the top 5 or 10% already. If you know how to do identity, IP, or location, or device status-based conditional access, you're definitely in the top 5%. But guess what? This is not free. As far as I could tell, you have to have a premium subscription in Azure Active Directory just to use these features. So although this is a recommendation, you gotta implement it, pay for it, manage it, right? So what else can we see? You may have heard that LastPass, I believe it is the most popular and widely used password manager for both personal and corporate use, was fully breached. Like they were just taken down completely by what appears to be a very, very clever and sophisticated series of attacks. And I'm not talking about this because of what was breached at LastPass. I'm talking about this because of how we have now learned how the LastPass employee was breached as part of the second or third wave of this breach. It started with an initial attack that included reconnaissance of all of the corporate data. They then targeted one of 4 DevOps engineers at LastPass who had access to highly secure information in the organization. They then correlated those employees with past data breaches to see what type of accounts, software, services those 4 employees used. They discovered that an employee used a software product for media streaming, and I think the speculation is it was Plex. Plex is a very popular home media streaming service, and they found that this employee had presumably a Plex account through prior data breaches that were recently disclosed just before this attack. Plex had a data breach. Well, they found the engineer's name in that data breach, said, aha, this person uses Plex. They then found a vulnerability in Plex that allowed them to plant malicious software on that host PC. So really, you're seeing the attack chain pile up here. Super sophisticated sequence of events to make this happen. And what's amazing is how quickly they did it from the time LastPass was first breached, I think in August, until they discovered this subsequent breach in November, December. Once they had got this DevOps engineer's home PC that had Plex on it, they compromised that PC, installed Keylogger, and the speculation is that that PC was used by the employee. That home PC was used by the employee for work-related purposes. So that employee logged into the LastPass VPN, entered his MFA, and then accessed the top secret, super sensitive corporate vault that only 4 employees had access to, and the attackers were able to ride that connection all the way into the corporate vault and compromise that vault. Once they got access to that vault through the keylogger, they were able to silently export the entire contents of that LastPass vault, based on what I'm reading. Crazy chain of events. So anyone who thinks they're smarter than the attackers, just stop right there. Like, there's no way. Like, the sophistication is pretty crazy here. Now, once they got into that secret corporate vault, that highly sensitive vault, that happened to have the decryption keys for their cloud storage service. It was kind of a backup repository for their fully encrypted AWS encrypted storage, where all customer LastPass vaults were stored. They apparently did have something equivalent to, say, an Azure Key Vault, so an encrypted storage repository, but this was the backup for those encryption keys. So just think of this series of events that had to occur in order for the attackers to pull this off. It is remarkable, like just stunning. So that is a lesson in what can happen in your corporate environment if you aren't careful. And this starts with one employee being phished, or just compromised inadvertently. Okay, so what are we talking about here? Like, there's no chance for us to defend against that level of sophisticated attacker. Just give up. And there's nothing we can do. It's way too advanced for us to fight against. So let's just say we have 3 layers for simplicity in the SMB space. Opportunistic threat actor. So this is just a random phishing email that gets blasted out to email addresses that have been on compromised lists or that are on stolen lists and hacker forums, whatever. And that'll include your employees. So your employees are constantly getting phishing emails, and I get them all the time. Both in my work email, my personal email, almost every email account I've had for a couple of years, I get phishing emails. Some are getting very good. And I was recently tricked into thinking one was real. And only once I checked out the links did I realize it was fake. It was very convincing. Second level is a targeted threat actor. And you might say, well, we're just some small company. No one would target us. Well, on the contrary, if you are a Microsoft partner, if you are a Dynamics partner, if you are an ISV, you are a target by definition because you are essentially what is being called a managed service provider. Managed service providers are being targeted specifically because they work with many different technology customers. And as a result, they often have access or credentials or some additional privilege with those customer environments as part of your work. If you're a Dynamics Business Central consultant, you may have logins for a customer tenant. If you're an ISV, you may have support interaction with customers that may expose credentials. So you are by definition a target. So that is an elevated risk for our industry and our community. Insider threat, game over. Some of you know that my 12-year-old daughter, who I call my cybersecurity intern, she has taught me some very, very valuable lessons. And simply because she wants to watch anime on YouTube, we have played this fun cat and mouse game where I say, you cannot watch YouTube after 9 p.m. She figures out a way to watch anime on YouTube after 9 p.m. And after spending several thousands of dollars, including having the services of a managed security solution provider, I had a phone call with them recently and I explained the scenario and they gave up. Like they were past the limit of their knowledge of how to stop a 12-year-old from accessing YouTube. And they said, oh, you just do this. And I said, no, my 12-year-old did this. And they said, oh, I didn't think of that. And they said, well, you could do that. I'm like, well, you didn't consider this. Like, oh, yeah. So here I am gaming this out with my managed security solution provider. They have not thought about an insider threat, period. It is abundantly clear. They have no training. They have no knowledge. They have no experience. Their posture is not to deal with insider threats. So if you have an insider threat in any form in your organization, game over. Like everything is lost. The wall has fallen, right? And winter is coming. Very, very difficult, even for corporations who spend tens of millions of dollars on their cybersecurity. So what are we talking about in terms of actual threats or vectors? Remote endpoint infections. So that home computer with Plex installed, right? Plex, it's been around forever. Someone figured out how to compromise it and go up the chain to wipe out LastPass. Application breach. Network attacks, that's the conventional, say someone's coming in your network through the firewall. System downtime. Not sure what I was thinking there. Someone could take down your systems, do a denial of service, I guess, is what I was thinking. Partner ISV data ransom and disclosure. So once you get compromised, they're not just going to, put, JPEGs and prank you on your network. They're going to steal your data. They're going to encrypt it, and they're going to ransom it or threaten you with disclosure if you don't pay the ransom. Well, what if that includes customer data? And even once they get in your network, how about traversal to your customer systems? If you have any credentials, any information about your customer network, your customer tenants, your customer logins, the natural end result is to traverse and target those networks because they're not done with you. You're just the small fish. What they want is your $500 million customer, right? Because they can pay the ransom or more ransom and they're a bigger target, not your 10 or 15 person organization. And then once they traverse to your customer data ransom and disclosure. So there's a significant liability aspect to this for partners and ISVs. So we need to be careful. So what can we do? This is just my outline for what I'm thinking we could possibly do, given that we're not going to spend $100 million on security, let alone $10,000 on security. Basic knowledge. You don't have to be an expert. There are just some basic things you can be aware of, and these can be common things that don't require a security certification or expertise. Security posture, an awareness, kind of just making security part of your organization, part of your processes, part of your development, part of your support routines, just an awareness and kind of orientation around security as a concern for your organization and your customers. Common tools. Many of are free or low cost. We're not talking enterprise-grade security tools. There are some simple common tools you can use to at least help. They're not going to prevent, but they may mitigate. They may help with a forensic investigation after the fact. They may help with law enforcement. So, if someone wants to break in your organization, assume it's possible, and these tools may just help mitigate the damage that is done. Security processes or routines. Once you know the basic knowledge, have some posture, and have some common tools, you can start to implement those in basic processes or everyday routines that you do. Learn a little bit about in Azure environment security. This is tough. I am not there yet. Azure is this entirely different universe. You got to figure out there's Windows security, network security, Azure security. There's all these different domains of security. Azure is an entirely different planet, and it has challenges, but there's some basic things you can do, such as Azure authentication and access. There are just a few options you can enable to at least be doing the bare minimum to help secure your Azure environment. And then cyber attack response. So that first question I asked, when customer contacts you and says that one of your employees sent out a phishing email to them, what do you do? If you say, oh, I don't know, I haven't thought about that, well, you need to think about that and at least have 3 bullet points on a piece of paper or a document somewhere that says, okay, here's who we call, here's what we do. And overall, one of the biggest challenges I'm finding in the SMB space for people who aren't into this, don't have dedicated staff, is very few things are configured properly by default. Nearly everything requires some level of additional configuration to achieve even a minimum level of security. So endpoint protection can be misconfigured. It just won't work. You could have UAC, user account control in Windows. By default, it's not as secure as it could be, right? The logging is not as sufficient as it could be. So all sorts of things require configuration and additional touch points. Most organizations just don't have the expertise to do it. So it's a big, big challenge. So number 1, have someone designated as an internal security lead. And it's just an arbitrary designation. They do not need to be a security expert. But it's like, hey, who is willing to take this on as a little side task? Maybe give them a bonus, or maybe give them a gift card and dinner out, free lunch once a month, whatever, for dealing with this additional administrative task. Because I'm going to guess not everyone's like a super geek like me and loves this stuff. And dealing with laptop configurations, making sure they're secure, or checking MFA settings every month, it's not necessarily going to be the most rewarding task. So perhaps a reward for someone who's willing to step up and do this, right? Managing checklists and basic documentation. Not sexy, but, it's like flossing and brushing your teeth, eating right, exercising is just something you got to do on a regular basis. One of the great points that the SMB Security 101 for SMBs presentation by Microsoft included is inventorying devices, accounts, resources. So if you configure the security on 10 laptops and you think you're in good shape, but then you don't realize there's an 11th or 12th computer out there that someone's using that is not configured securely, guess what? All the work you did on the 10 didn't matter, because there was an open backdoor on number 11 or number 12 that you didn't know about. So having an inventory and trying to control that inventory, unfortunately, is one of those boring, unglamorous tasks that needs to be done. Auditing Azure, Office 365, Dynamics, and any other services and accounts or applications you use. Again, absolutely unsexy task. It's drudgery, but you got to do it to understand what your security attack surface is and how you control it and manage it. And unfortunately, you can't just do it in January of 2023 and have that ride on that for the next 3 years. You're probably going to have to do it every couple of months. Coordinate basic IT processes to add security focus. So if you have a new employee, how do you configure their computer securely? If an employee leaves your company, how do you lock things down to limit their access so that someone can't ride their old credentials? So, Jeremy says, does anyone remember what this device does or who uses it? Absolutely. I look at a VM, I'm like, what is that VM? Like, I see the name, doesn't mean anything to me. I have no recollection why I created that VM. And it's like, I have a stack of laptops over here in the corner. Wait, have I configured those laptops? I just don't remember. So unless I have the full inventory, a checklist, and a grid saying, okay, here are the 5 things I need to do to configure these securely. And I've got my kids, I've got my wife, I've got mobile devices, right? Everyone's in the same boat. And if you have people using home PCs, just like that LastPass DevOps engineer, yikes. Like, how do you inventory those devices? Well, you probably just need to restrict access to only authorized devices. And that gets into a complicated area. So coordinate your basic IT processes to add a security focus. New computer, security. Employee leaves, security. New account, security. Changing configuration, security, right? Not glamorous. Contact info for your managed security solution provider, MSSP, if you have one. If you don't have one, you may want to try to find one, just at least have them on call on an hourly rate. So you have someone to contact in case there's a problem. Contact info for cyber insurance and or law enforcement. If you think is the operative word there. If you think you have cyber insurance coverage, you should find that phone number and they will be the first person that you call because they often have procedures and they'll bring in people to handle it for you because the alternative is potentially paying a large bill. I suspect that if you are a small organization and you think you have cyber insurance, you probably don't, or you have some type of insurance that doesn't cover what you think it covers. So that's another lesson I would offer to look into. And to the extent this internal security lead has the time, the attention span, the interest, try to stay aware of basic best practices and general threats because things change over time, right? So this is not something you do once and forget about it. It is going to be a constant exercise to maintain. Windows security basics, assuming you're using Windows in your organization, if you're a Microsoft partner, that's my assumption. As we saw from the LastPass breach, if you can have separate work-only computers, that at least reduces some risk and reduces the attack surface that you have. And that would mean work-only computer, everything else just not allowed to do or access what that employee would normally access. So that adds a technical level of expertise I'm going to guess many organizations don't have. Once you start to, even if you can pay for and issue those work laptops and say, do not only use this for work, not for personal, how do you enforce it? You know, it becomes very technically difficult to do some of these things. Set user access control to the highest setting in Windows. It actually can stop some activity from occurring automatically. Now, if the user automatically clicks yes on everything, obviously that will bypass. But if you're doing nothing on the computer and this pops up, you can at least be suspicious and report that to your security lead. It's a tool. It's free. It's easy to implement. Yes, it pops up the dialogue to click through occasionally, but it's, in a sense, it's a small price to pay for the potential security it offers. Restrict PowerShell and scripting and enable script block logging. Now, in the Business Central dev space, we do use PowerShell. It has a legitimate role, but not everyone in your organization needs PowerShell access, right? So I've received pushback on this, but PowerShell is one of the number one means to compromise Windows PCs because it is incredibly powerful. By default, it can have full run of your system, can do anything. It can do it silently, and it can be used in such a sophisticated manner, you will have no idea that anything happened. Script block logging, I only learned about just recently. Even after years of digging into this stuff, I'd never heard of this before. It showed up in an NSA white paper of security recommendations. First time I'd heard of it. So unfortunately, you have to go like into some deep registry setting or some group policy setting in order to enable this. It is not enabled by default. Crazy. So these are some things you can do for free. Install sysinternal sysmon. Again, it's free, not deployed or installed with Windows by default for various reasons. Once you install sysmon, it automatically logs a ton of activity on the PC to Windows Event Log in a dedicated log. And you might say, well, why would you do this? And a great quote by Swift on Security on Twitter. She has some great information for just like the normal human being who wants to secure their systems. She said that their organization calls it the flight data recorder for computers. So just like the black box in an airplane, The black box doesn't stop a catastrophe, doesn't stop mistakes, doesn't stop a crash, but it at least lets you know what happened after the fact, so you can start to patch the holes, you can start to reverse engineer what happened and do some forensics. So it's not a magic bullet, but it helps. Increasing the size of Windows event log. By default, most Windows event logs are much too small, and you can easily just overwrite events once you have a flood of activity. So increase those. Corporate VPNs. If you have a VPN into an internal corporate network, device-specific IDs and approval, so that someone grabs a new laptop or phone, it cannot access even with the user credentials. If an attacker tries to connect, they will not be able to connect without device-specific approval, and one-time passwords as MFA. And as we saw, MFA has been bypassed for LastPass, for Uber, several others. Just people the attackers walk right through the MFA through social engineering and other techniques like the phishing websites. Endpoint Protection, aka antivirus. Not too many people use additional antivirus. A lot of people just use default Windows Defender, which is okay, but it doesn't have the management controls, the policies, the reporting, the notifications that you might want as an organization. And as we all know, password manager, you probably heard that, but my rough estimate is less than half of partners use a corporate password manager. They're storing customer information in SharePoint, in OneNote, whatever, shared repositories that are unsecured. Bad news. Endpoint protection, also known as antivirus or EDR, endpoint detection and response. And as I mentioned, I would recommend one for corporate use that has a portal. So Microsoft Defender has that. And I use one called BlackBerry Cylance. Yes, that BlackBerry. They acquired a company called Cylance. And these solutions and many others have management portals where you can see, okay, these 10 laptops are configured. Here's their status. Here's the last update. Here's the threats that were found on those machines. And you can get notifications as a result of this management portal. So your security lead can at least know that, okay, Tom working from home on the VPN, we saw a threat, it was stopped, but okay, what's going on that Tom had this alert? Did he install something, download something, click something, whatever? Microsoft Defender, my understanding, it is largely signature based, meaning it's taking hashes of threats or whatever technique they're using, comparing a file or an activity against those signatures, and determining whether this is legitimate or allowed or to be blocked. My problem with Microsoft Defender, which is just as meaningful as Microsoft Dynamics, is that it is a licensing nightmare, which I'll show you in a second. I happen to use Cylance because it existed before Defender kind of had matured as this monstrosity from Microsoft. And so Cylance works for me. It's about $3 per endpoint that I install it on. And it gives me the control like script blocking, PowerShell blocking, additional behavior detection that seems to work for me. No one solution is going to be perfect. No one solution is going to catch all threats. So you just got to choose one. They generally will not install side by side. So many others. Now, why don't I like Defender? This is why I do not like Microsoft Defender. Not because it's not a good product, but this is Microsoft Defender. Just like if you look at a list of Microsoft Dynamics, you'll have over 20 products listed that are licensed separately. And any customer, such as myself, who tries to understand what they need on their own, you will be absolutely lost. I've looked at these. I kind of understand what some of them do, but to try and purchase and acquire licenses for this and install and manage it, it's crazy. Like, I know someone who deals with this will say, oh, it's simple. You just need this one and we'll license it for you. Well, you're going to have to take that step. And unless small and medium-sized businesses do that, they will just look at this, their eyes will glaze over and they'll give up, which is what I did. It's like, I'm not even going to bother to try Defender. It's crazy trying to figure out how I acquire the Defender that I need and what licensing I would need to acquire. So that's why I don't like it. It has nothing to do with its technical merits or capabilities. I've heard it's good. it's way too hard to figure out how to purchase. Business Password Manager. If you are storing internal corporate credentials that you're sharing, shared resources, anything client related, you really need this. If you're storing anything in SharePoint, OneNote, heaven forbid, Word document, Excel file, or text document, really need to stop that now and transition to a secure password manager. It is far better than those alternatives. They're not perfect, but it's better. The candidates I'm looking at the moment, 1Password, Keeper, and Bitwarden. Why? Because they have a business plan, granular permissions, groups and sharing, auditing and logging. They have an SOC 2 certification for their storage, and they have published penetration tests. Now, you could say, well, what about LastPass, KeePass, RoboForm, Dashlane, and others? My concerns with those, they do not publish or publicize their SOC 2 certification. I have read claims that some of them have that certification. They make no mention of it on their website anywhere. You cannot find verification of it. No penetration tests are published. Some may claim they have them. No publicly available information. I happen to see that RoboForm mentioned a security review in their release notes. That's the first time I've seen that for RoboForm, which I happen to use for personal use. So those are my concerns. Then I have technical security concerns. I've figured out that RoboForm only uses so many password iterations when generating the key for a vault. And it's far below the recommended industry standards now. And there's a reason for that, but they say, well, you need to have a stronger password. That's far more effective than adding additional iterations for your key generation. I don't disagree, but when NIST and the NSA recommend at least 500,000 or 600,000 iterations, and RoboForm's new standard is 100,000, it's like, what's going on here? Is this a best practice or is it not? Are you saying that NIST and the NSA are incorrect? So those are my technical security concerns. I'm not an expert, but I'm trying to learn this stuff. Some alternatives I've seen more in the enterprise space are something like Thycotic, and it's now acquired by a company called Delinea. So in the enterprise space, it's an entirely different world. And they are using things like identity and access management solutions. So these are enterprise solutions that manage authentication, single sign-on, access control. So it's not just a password manager. So it's kind of a different arena for those alternatives. So I've looked at Keeper, not as user-friendly as RoboForm. So I'm just kind of torn as to what I'm going to do here for our business use, but I'm going to have to choose something. Okay, mobile devices. Very common. Employees use mobile devices. They'll use their own typically because it's just crazy for a corporation to issue mobile devices and have employees carry two. It does happen, but less likely that the mobile device itself is going to be compromised, but it can happen. More likely social engineering, right? So MFA prompts for MFA fatigue, text message phishing, email phishing, which I'll show you an example later. Malicious apps, so they may accidentally install the wrong authenticator app on their mobile device. There's a thread on Twitter going on right now in the cybersecurity realm. There, if you look and type in authenticator in any of the app stores, you'll see a dozen options. Many of them are fraudulent or malicious. If you want Google Auth, Microsoft Auth, Authy, you will have to very carefully search for them, because if you accidentally choose the one with a white background and the blue shield, that can be a malicious authenticator app. Scary. Unsecured Wi-Fi. Several stories of spoof Wi-Fi, SSID spoofing, which is next up, malicious Wi-Fi hotspots. They can just scoop up all your employee credentials as they log in from an airport, parking lot, Starbucks, whatever. Very, very real threat from a mobile device. Lost or stolen device as a threat. If the laptop is locked or the phone is locked, it may stop a casual attacker, but you can drop that hard drive from the laptop into another computer and read it unless it's encrypted with BitLocker. So legitimate concern. You forget your laptop at the airport. Do you have remote wipe capabilities and disable capabilities on your laptops? It's a real challenge. There are cases of 0 days, zero-click vulnerabilities on mobile devices. From what I've read, those are typical nation-state actors compromising those of a geopolitical adversary. So they spend millions and millions of dollars on those 0 days. They don't want to, use that 0 day and expose it on some schmo like Steve at the airport. So mobile phishing, why is this important? Well, I got this email today, and the image is so large and the text is so large that it fills up your entire screen. And I happen to be on desktop, but if this were on my mobile device, you would not be able to tell, obviously at a glance, that it is a phishing email. So this is a malicious email. It's a fake email address at the top, artconnections.com, compromised domain, presumably. Probably has a full-on phishing website built into it. You would not be able to tell that it is a fake website. You would look like a legitimate Costco survey. They're probably asking for personal information to say, hey, you're going to win a prize, right? So this is why mobile devices are potentially at higher risk, because you just don't have the information available to you in that form factor to tell that it's obvious. Email and browser, phishing, malware links, attachments. I've seen several cases of zero-click vulnerabilities where people are explaining how this works. You open a PDF, it has malicious JavaScript that then jumps off to an attack on that device. Like, very, very difficult to fight against. You can pay for services like Proofpoint. Proofpoint is a company that has comprehensive email protection subscriptions. So they monitor your mailbox for incoming and outgoing threats. They can potentially detect information disclosure or exfiltration of corporate data. They will detect incoming threats, and they have a network operations center where they're monitoring this across all of their customers. So they actually have a very advanced analytical team who sees these trends emerge and spread across customer accounts. So they have some great reports on activity that they see. They're a leader in that space. Defender, Microsoft Defender for Office 365, similar concept, but again, try figuring out how to sign up for that. Good luck. Smaller organizations who don't have the E3, E5 license levels, you need to increase your license level in order to get these protections. In the browser side, you have uBlock Origin browser extension, and I use AdBlock Plus, which some debate about the ad blocker extensions, but it's better than nothing. And any browser extension, you are at risk if you install the wrong one. Just like those fake authenticator apps, there are fake and malicious browser extensions in the extension stores, the legitimate, say, Chrome extension store. You have to be very careful you're not installing a malicious one. Pi-hole DNS, very low cost, simple option. There's some technical knowledge required, but very easy to set up. There are instructions on how to do it step by step. Set up a Pi-hole DNS server on your internal network. You run your own DNS, and it blocks requests to advertising websites, tracking websites, malicious websites, things like that. So through those block lists, it protects network activity at the DNS level. There are web filtering services that can be done at the corporate level. That's typically at the enterprise space. You need an advanced firewall. You need to have a third-party service that monitors all of your inbound, outbound traffic. Starts to get pretty complex. So I'm assuming that is outside the realm of most of us in the SMB space. Remote workers, as I've alluded to, massive challenge. If someone's on their laptop at Starbucks, how do you monitor the security, control the security? If they connect to a customer tenant environment and there's a keylogger, if they connect to your corporate network, how do you control that? There are some answers. I don't know that the good answers are viable for the SMB space. You've all heard of two-factor authentication, certainly. There's Google Authenticator, Windows Authenticator that has the numeric code that's called time-based one-time password, TOTP. Great solution, but as we saw, it can be bypassed in these phishing platforms transparently. You won't even know it's happened until it's too late. Google Authenticator, simple, it's good. It appears to be a trusted authenticator because they are not trying to track your activity or sell it for marketing purposes. as far as I've found so far. Windows Authenticator, it does have the benefit of backup and sync with a personal MS account. I'm told it does not work with a corporate MS account, which is just like, what? I don't know why. But Windows Authenticator does have very heavy telemetry in Microsoft fashion, and it is tracking your authentication entries, which many consider to be too intrusive for operational security. So there are telemetry concerns, which I've linked down below. Authy does also have backup and sync and multi-device access, but oops, I put personal MS account. That is just an Authy account. Sorry, let me just fix this on the fly. I'll just say backup and sync. Now, Authy, there are significant telemetry concerns. It is logging and hoovering up far more data than should be justified for telemetry purposes. And so after reading about what they're sucking up, it looks like they are trying to sell that information to third parties in order to say, hey, we have 10,000 users who are logging in your platform. You want to know more about that? I don't know what they're doing it for, but they are essentially capturing all of your TOTP entries, the names of those entries in their telemetry based on these reports that I've read. So I'm very leery of Authy at this time. They've also had multiple security breaches and vulnerabilities in their application. So it's sketch. Very convenient to use, but I'm very wary of using it. Now, one better option, I think at this point, is many or most password managers, such as 1Password, Keeper, Bitwarden, and I use RoboForm. Almost all of them that I checked off a quick glance, you have their own TOTP entry. And what's nice is, let's say I log into, say, Google. I can have my Google password entry, and I can attach the TOTP code to that Google entry. So as soon as I log in, my RoboForm password manager pops up the 6-digit code that I can enter. So it's actually quite convenient. It's all stored in my secure password manager, and I don't have to have a second device or pull up my phone, and it syncs across all my devices. It's available on my desktop browser, my mobile device, my iPad, my laptop. So automatic sync is built into my password manager. So I'm thinking password manager TOTP is the way to go if that works for your logins, right? Now, Jonathan at Microsoft has said that YubiKey or FIDO keys are the gold standard at this time for two-factor authentication. So I have several right here. I've got the YubiKey Bio. I've got a YubiKey USB-C. They make several different types of models depending on what form factor or device you need to plug into. But these are hardware tokens. These are USB keys. You must plug them in. The browser application does a cryptographic authentication with the key. You then have to physically touch the key to trigger that authentication. So you have to acknowledge, yes, I am looking to authenticate, and it's not an attacker popping up that prompt. So these work very well, very smooth. You have to be careful with your backups, but it pops up that type of prompt on a Google Chrome browser. I insert my key, touch it, and I'm authenticated. No code required. So pros and cons of that. A little less convenient, but supposedly more secure. Backups. So we can't just get rid of any notion that you can defend yourself comprehensively against an attacker. You're going to get phished. You're going to get account compromises. You're going to get malware. You're going to install the wrong app. You're going to make mistakes. You cannot possibly do all these things perfectly given our skill level collectively. So assume you're going to be attacked, assume you're going to be phished, assume you're going to be breached, assume your data is going to be encrypted, and you're going to be hit with ransomware. I'm just assuming I'm going to scrap the hard drive or the computer and start over. So if my laptop is compromised, pull out that drive, buy a new one for $100, start from scratch. Can I restore and resync from backup? One second. As we use more SaaS services, in theory, this becomes easier. But I'm choosing not to keep some files on the cloud because they're sensitive or private or my taxes or whatever, personal records, because I don't even trust OneDrive, because if my Office 365 account is breached, there goes my OneDrive. So I am storing locally on a NAS, keeping that NAS offline to the extent I can. So I'm juggling that. And so I need to have a backup solution for my local network files. And do you have backups of your workstations, servers, VMs, whatever, code repositories? Do you have SQL databases or anything like that that you need to back up? Do you have files, deliverables, customer proposals, customer work product that you've delivered to customers that you need to keep? Source code and artifacts. Do you have a Git repository? Do you have DevOps? Do you have those artifacts stored and cataloged in a secondary source, hopefully online somewhere that is unlikely to be compromised? All your Office 365 data, OneNote, OneDrive, SharePoint. What if that is all compromised? Even if it's not disclosed, maybe it's deleted as part of a ransomware attack. And if you're using Microsoft Dynamics, whether that's Business Central CRM, do you have a backup of that? Difficult questions, right? LAN security, this is an entire career of knowledge, and there's no way you could possibly have expertise in this entire area, but there's just some basic. No open ports on your LAN, period. If you have port 3389 with NAT open on your LAN, you are in deep, deep trouble. So close all your ports, your home router, your work firewall, whatever, close all ports. The only exception would be a company VPN port. Unfortunately, it's still necessary. You got to connect somehow through the firewall to the corporate VPN. And so that is the exception. But even that is becoming high risk now. Multiple VPN appliances and network devices have recently had 0-day compromises. My VPN appliance that I paid $1,000 for by a security company has had at least one 0-day vulnerability. I've had to physically unplug my VPN appliance till it's patched. That was SonicWall. Fortinet recently had multiple 0-day vulnerabilities in their network access products. So no one is immune. If someone says, oh, I use Cisco or I use this or whatever, doesn't matter. Just a matter of time till the vulnerability is found and it is compromised. So I'm looking into the concept of, it's called like a reverse proxy VPN, but hard to find information on it. And it seems like it's more of an enterprise solution. So I don't yet have a solution that would allow me to close my VPN port. If you do a VPN, as I mentioned before, device ID approval. So I require a device to be ID'd and approved in my VPN appliance before they can even log in. Then on top of the device ID and the login, I require one-time passwords. So it's essentially 3 layers. I also have GeoIP restrictions so that only a couple countries can access my VPN. You try to log in from another foreign country, it will be blocked. Never, ever, ever expose RDP or 3389 for a VM, a server, machine, whatever. Any access over RDP is going to be compromised very quickly. I mentioned Pi-hole DNS. That's a great way to secure your LAN. I use GeoIP blocking. Some will claim that that's not a great solution. It is a solution. It is not the solution. It is one of many solutions to limit access to your network. Next generation firewall. If you have a corporate firewall, that can have application filtering. It can have malware detection if configured properly. Again, requires a level of expertise you may not have in your organization. Logging and log archiving whenever possible. This is a huge problem. Very difficult to do this for small organizations. Nothing out of the box to support this. Requires a significant amount of effort to do this well. I have spent dozens and dozens of hours, spent a lot of money, and I am just barely competent in this space. Very difficult challenge to log detailed network and firewall activity. Azure security. Enable Azure AD with MFA and number matching. Number matching is going to become the default policy in Azure going forward. I don't know exactly when. I think it's just recently they enabled that. That uses Microsoft Authenticator to do a push notification, enter your number match, and approve. So if you don't have number matching, you got to go back and enable it for your organization. Conditional access policies will restrict access to your Azure environment based off of geography, IP, device profiles, users, whatever. Unfortunately, it is not free. You have to sign up for Azure AD Premium, $6 a user a month per user. Or you have to have Microsoft 365 E3 or E5 levels, not Office 365, I've learned. So I have Office 365 E3, not included. I have to do Microsoft 365, whatever that is. Again, Microsoft licensing quagmire. Least privilege access. Do any of your Azure AD users have permissions they do not absolutely need? Can you restrict all normal user logins to have no admin access and create a separate controlled admin account that you use? So even if your Office 365 account is breached, they can't get anything in Azure. You would have to have a separate login, which requires what is sometimes called break glass access in order to get access to the admin level of Azure AD. So that's an alternative. Set up your separate Azure AD admin account to restrict that access and really lock down that account. So you've done all this stuff. It won't be good enough, but maybe it'll slow some down. It'll stop the low-level attacks from occurring. But anyone even remotely bare minimum sophistication will be able to compromise you. So if it happens, when it happens, what do you do? Who do you call? Number one recommendation I've heard is if you do have a legitimate, actual, real, tangible cyber insurance policy that does have the coverage you think you would want to have, you would call them first. They will set everything in motion and they have plans to make that happen. Hopefully you've spoken with them in advance, but they would, from what I've heard, they might be your first call and they will contact the appropriate people to make things happen. If you think you have some type of cyber insurance or risk and, cyber incident insurance, I highly recommend you read every sentence in that policy, because chances are, as a small organization, you do not have the coverage you might think you have. My insurance, my liability insurance, mentioned cyber tech policy. If you read it, has nothing to do with cyber, has nothing to do with tech, has nothing to do with a cyber attack. There is, as far as I could tell, no true cyber insurance coverage. That, my understanding, is a specific policy, and given the number of attacks that are occurring, is going to become harder and harder for a small business to get coverage. And if you do, you're going to have to comply with a laundry list of requirements, including potentially an audit. And if you do not follow those recommendations, guess what? Your policy may be void. That's my assumption as to how this is going to work out. If you have an MSSP instead of cyber insurance, they may be your first call. And then law enforcement may be a call as well. But after the fact, there's not a lot they can do but try and understand what happened. NSA, the United States National Security Agency, actually has a lot of good public information on security and what you can do to secure things. And that's how I learned about the PowerShell script block logging, was with an NSA white paper. And so they recently published this PDF. It is NSA best practices for securing your home network. Very timely given the LastPass breach, right? So you could have the best corporate security policies, but if you have an employee with a compromised home network accessing your VPN or your resources, game over, right? It's fallen. So things like limit use of administrator account, probably not widely done, but easy to do, requires just a little bit of inconvenience. Exercise caution when accessing public hotspots, right? That requires a level of discipline among every single employee. One mistake, all is lost. Do not exchange home and work content. So if you have someone doing, online shopping or installing an app or some software on their work computer, all your security could potentially be bypassed. They're essentially an insider threat at that point. Use separate devices for different activities. I'd love to get there. I'm not there yet. I'd love to have a dedicated work computer and then separate personal computer. It requires a high level of diligence, right, to separate those activities. It is inconvenient. Can you pull it off as a small organization? But it's an NSA best practice for home networks. So, yep, pretty obvious stuff. You say, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But can you implement it realistically? Very different question. If you start to delve into security, you will hear a lot of this. But you need this other antivirus that is better. Everyone has their pet product, right? This other password manager is better. If you mention your password manager on Twitter, well, we use this other one and it's better. I like this one because it's better. Well, a lot of people like LastPass up until December 2022. And now it's kind of like, it's a battle scar that many people are still using it because they've invested so much time. It's considered a security risk now, unfortunately. They made some significant mistakes in their implementation that is exposing you to operational security risks. So people who used to recommend LastPass, well, that's why I don't recommend one. I say, here's what I think is viable options and do your own due diligence, caveat emptor. A better firewall and VPN. So I happen to have SonicWall. My friend says, oh, we use Fortinet because SonicWall is trash. Fortinet is so much better. Well, up until the last couple months when Fortinet disclosed multiple zero-day vulnerabilities in their network equipment that are being widely exploited worldwide. So everyone is at risk here. No single product is going to be perfect. If you are in the hardcore camp, you might know what a SIEM is, an SIEM, a Security Information and Event Management System. I'm trying to use one called Graylog. It's basically this corporate enterprise centralized logging and monitoring platform. Very complex, very expensive. Graylog has a free version, but you have to figure everything out yourself. And the alternative is pay a minimum of $2,000 or $3,000 a month just for this one application to log. Intrusion detection, intrusion prevention. Forget about it. In theory, my firewall does have IDS, IPS, but it can only detect the traffic it scans. Anytime a laptop uses HTTPS to connect to an external website, my firewall is unable to monitor that encrypted traffic. You have to turn the firewall into a man-in-the-middle proxy. You have to install certificates. It is a bear, and that's why very few organizations use it. XDR is just an extension of Endpoint Protection, and that's a term you may hear. Security Operations Center monitoring. If you're a mid-market company, an SMB with a SOC, hats off to you. You're instantly in the top 5%. If you're paying that level for that level of service, very expensive. Phishing, training, and testing. Can you train your employees on this? It's a task. Enterprises spending tens or hundreds of millions of dollars are challenged trying to do this. So can we as SMBs pull this off? It all costs money, and that's one of the challenges. SMBs are probably not going to spend $10,000 a month on security and maybe not even $1,000 a month on security. So how do you try and secure yourself? Then someone once told me recently on Twitter, well, something is better than nothing. You should implement this free open source SIEM to collect all your logs because it's free and something is better than nothing. Well, is it really? Open source is free, people will tell you. Not necessarily. Nothing is free because guess what? It takes hours and hours to figure out how to set this up. It has to be hosted somewhere. Well, is it free if it's misconfigured, disabled, unmanaged, unmonitored, unmaintained, and unsupported? No. It's just this boat anchor on your network doing nothing and potentially having its own security vulnerabilities. Nothing is free. And is something better than nothing? If you're not configuring it, maintaining it, if you don't have the expertise to support it, like realistically, can it be in your network? No. MSSP. If you have a managed security solutions provider, good for you. If you're actually paying for their services, good for you. If you're lucky enough to have a minimally competent managed security provider, well, pop the champagne because you are a lucky company. I've had calls with many security providers, and they will solve all of your security problems because they know everything. They have all the answers. And boy, that sales call, they will make you feel like an idiot and that you really need to hire them. Otherwise, the world's going to end. But number one is cost. They're expensive. They're no cheaper than your Dynamics consulting services. Number two is competence. The guy in the sales call will talk a great game. When you actually get in touch with the person who's monitoring your network or helping with their firewall, like I have, and I discovered my 12-year-old is outwitting their entire organization, I was able to make an assessment of their competence. They are not competent to support me to mitigate the risk my 12-year-old presents. I was well beyond their area of expertise. Service, are they any good? I've had issues where an MSSP says they did something for me. My firewall went down. They says they made a configuration change. Lost a bunch of settings. Like just the level of competence and service they can provide in the mid-market for the prices I'm paying, very low expectations. It will disappoint you if you think you're getting high quality, competent service, in my experience. And a very common theme I'm seeing in many organizations that offer security services, overconfidence and arrogance. It's very unfortunate because it puts a bad taste in the mouth of customers. And customers think they're getting a certain level of security, which is probably higher than it is. And when they realize it's not there, it's too late. So I can just spot it a mile away at this point. Oh, we do X, Y, and Z. Your antivirus is bad. You need to buy our antivirus that is good. Your firewall sucks. Ours is much better. Statements like that, like I just instantly know. They may think they know what they're talking about, but it just hasn't panned out. As another example, you'll read an article. Only four simple steps SMBs can take to close those SaaS security gaps. Yes, sirree, Mr. A.N. Ananth from NetSurian, selling his product, right? He's going to tell you those 4 tips that SMBs can take to close their SaaS security gaps, Just 4. Boy, you need to start with understanding your shared responsibility model for cloud security for your SaaS apps. Now, if you're an SMB and you understood what that sentence means, kudos to you. I just kind of rolled my eyes. Next, you need to monitor your SaaS app configurations and integrations. Really? Just monitor them? Yep. Okay, go forth, monitor. Problem solved. Number 2, check that off the list. Number 3, understand the shared responsibility model between you and your managed services provider. Wait, number 1 was understand the shared responsibility model for cloud security for your SaaS apps. How is that different on the shared responsibility model? Wait, no idea what this means. Number 4, integrate all of your SaaS security telemetry with your Security Operations Center monitoring tools and Security Information and Event Management Platform, which you might recognize that phrase as the SIEM that I mentioned earlier, SIEM. Now, if you are an SMB, as this article claims, and you have SaaS security telemetry, a Security Operations Center that has monitoring tools, and a SIEM platform, you are spending thousands of dollars a month, minimum $3,000 a month on those services if you were to acquire them yourself. SMB. So these statements make wild assumptions about the spending, the competence, the focus, the attention, the investment in the security infrastructure. I do not associate any of this with what I consider to be the SMB space, at least SMB Dynamics partners and ISVs in the United States. So I find these statements kind of laughable. And so this is part of the problem. If you try to read these articles for valuable information, this is what you're going to get. And unfortunately, it's kind of like just wishy-washy sales jargon that's been pulled down from the enterprise space. So I don't have answers. I don't have conclusions. I don't have silver bullets. This is not something you're just going to achieve security and walk away. But I do anticipate that this is going to get worse. How we are going to solve it collectively as SMBs and ISVs, SMB partners and ISVs in the dynamic space, I do not know. It's going to be basic. We're going to try to do the minimum we can and hope for the best. But yeah, so that's where I'm at. It's a work in progress. I'm learning. I'm working on certifications. I'm working on conferences. I'm attending cybersecurity training. And I have several thousands of pages of books that I haven't read. And yeah, so this is just my journey, sharing what I'm trying to learn. And I'm trying to kind of communicate this in as simple manner as possible. So those of you who have a life and are not cybersecurity geeks might be able to adopt some of these practices. So with that, cheers. Have a good week. Try not to let this haunt you, but if there's one or two things you picked up that you could actually do and implement in your organization, let me know. Let me know what you weren't doing that you were able to do that was simple enough. And I'll probably do follow-on videos to say, okay, here's how you implement Sysmon. Here's what it does for you, and here's why you do it. It takes 5 minutes, but you got to do it on every single computer in your organization. So maybe I'll do follow-ups. So cheers, enjoy, fight the good battle. Talk to you later.